He has been a man who has worked as hard in that office as any man who has ever held it. He has been a man who is as deeply concerned for bringing peace to this nation and the world as anyone in this room. He has been a man who's been deeply disappointed because he has not been able to achieve that.
This is Second Sunday, a continuing series of prize-winning NBC documentaries. We begin a new year with a look at yesterday and a judgment for tomorrow. Tonight, Second Sunday presents The Johnson Years. Here now is Bill Ryan.
The Johnson years. It may sound, and indeed might be, presumptuous to attempt at this time even the most tenuous judgment of a man who leaves office as deep in controversy as has ever involved an American president. But the objective of this Second Sunday is not judgment on a grand scale. Ours is not a search for Lyndon Baines Johnson's place in history. Only the foolhardy second-guess the future. But now that the heat and turmoil are subsiding, now that inflamed tempers are beginning to cool, and Mr. Johnson walks towards the sidelines while the spotlight glares on Richard Milhous Nixon, we will look among Mr. Johnson's contemporaries for a tentative evaluation of his presidency. Our search is for only a preliminary understanding of this complex man, this tall paradox from Texas, this grandiloquent Pertinalis farm boy who succeeded to the White House and launched the Johnson years. In the fog-scented air of San Francisco, sidewalk sages already are vocally writing Mr. Johnson's page in tomorrow's history. Barry Simmons of NBC News began our study of the Johnson years with informal talks with San Franciscans. Simmons started with an inquiry into the job the president has accomplished.
The only thing that I think he made progress in is that he did help in the housing, he did help in the urban areas, he did help the poor. But I think he incited quite a bit of fire in not curbing the civil rights, and letting them get out of hand.
I think he failed in practically everything ever done. I don't see any area where he done any good.
I think he's done a pretty good job considering the fact that when he first got in, I didn't want him in. And also considering the fact that he first went into office at the death of President Kennedy. And I think that he's proven himself to be quite a man.
I think it was a disaster, and I'm very glad it's over, though I don't expect the Nixon one to be any better. I don't see how it could possibly be any worse than President Johnson's administration.
I think the times were bad for him or for anyone. I think he, other than the war, I think he did very well, like poverty programs, education, which I think are very important, but it was a holdback with the war. It hindered him in every way.
As a man who had all the pressures that Lyndon Johnson had, that he had all the things going against him that he did a job that I don't think any other man at that time could do.
The most incompetent and dangerous presidents that this country has ever had.
Historians, unlike others more cautious, are beginning to draw their own conclusions about how the future will treat the present. One of the more articulate and provocative of historians is Eric Goldman, author, Rollins Professor of History at Princeton University, and, for a brief period, a special consultant to the president. Dean Mell, NBC News, drove to Princeton to talk with Professor Goldman.
What were President Johnson's solid accomplishments as a president?
I think his key accomplishment was that he was a president who understood many of the needs of ordinary people and did something about him. He'll long be remembered for such achievements as getting Medicare through. He was a man who felt for the problems of old people, and he did something about it. He'll long be remembered for getting the first sweeping federal aid to education bill through, because he was a man, and is a man, who was profoundly convinced that education is a cure of many things. Perhaps he believes it's a cure of too many things. And he did something about it. In doing something about it, he brought a special quality to the office. Sometimes I think of President Johnson in a way that will seem incongruous to some people. I think of him perhaps as Prime Minister Johnson rather than as President Johnson. That is, he thought of himself proudly and properly as a man who came from Congress and was leading Congress. And he concerned himself at times much more with leading Congress than with leading the nation.
To many an American, the Vietnam War has been a millstone of shame hung around the nation's neck by Mr. Johnson. But as Professor Goldman noted, to Mr. Johnson, Vietnam was not a great wrong, but a holy cause.
He is profoundly convinced that he was and is right. He believed that it was fundamental to the security of our nation to hold Southeast Asia from the communists. That's what he believes, and he believes that history will vindicate him. And we'll have to wait for history.
In 1964, after a year as president, following President Kennedy's assassination, Mr. Johnson was swept into office with the greatest plurality ever given a candidate in American history. Less than 4 years later, he withdrew as a candidate for re-election after reaching what may have been a historic low in public esteem because of Vietnam, a war which clouded every aspect of his administration. In that tortured land, Jack Russell, NBC News, Saigon, asked Dr. Ton That Tien, a former Vietnamese cabinet member, a friend and advisor to President Thieu, for his views of Mr. Johnson.
How would you overall evaluate President Johnson's policy toward South Vietnam?
We owe him much. In fact, the survival of this country was to a great extent credible to him because he took the decision to come in at a very critical time and all that. But simply because at the end of his term, he wants to do something for himself, to get himself a name. He has thrown away the gratitude and even the affection that the Vietnamese should have given him. That's the way he has handled the thing since October, especially November, has made the Vietnamese wish that he wasn't there. And that is something very tragic in my view.
Do you believe that President Johnson then has failed in Vietnam?
Well, it's not just Mr. President Johnson, it's the Democratic administration which has failed in Vietnam, who's been responsible for this 5 years of wavering in Vietnam. Either you go in, you fight a war, or you don't. But by wavering like this, you waste a lot of lives and money for no purpose.
Russell spoke, too, with the men who have turned Vietnam policy into the reality of war, GIs doing the fighting.
What do you think about President Johnson?
I think he could have done things a little better than he has done. I really don't like Johnson that much.
I don't really care for him myself. As a president, I don't think he was a good president. I would have much rather had Barry Goldwater in there. I think we should have gone in here with the idea of winning it, not just letting it drag on out.
Well, when he stopped the bombing, he made his biggest mistake. And I think if they pulled all the troops out of Vietnam, this war would stop.
He did as right as he could have done, I'll put it this way. But I'd say civilians in the States and other people tied his hands somewhat. He couldn't do. He was somewhat like Westmoreland. Westmoreland had the right idea, but he couldn't function as he should have also. But as a man, and to the best that he could do, he did do all right in Vietnam.
I think he made great progress in Vietnam. If you consider the facts, what was taking place here before he took office, back when President Kennedy was in office, and up to now, I think we have at this time gained quite a bit.
A militant minority of America's youth converted President Johnson's holy war in Vietnam into a holy war of their own against the president. Rennie Davis, a spokesman for the National Mobilization Committee, a bitter anti-Vietnam group, commented with obvious deep prejudice against LBJ.
Well, Lyndon Johnson should not go down as a great president by any means. I think that for thousands of young people who have been active in the anti-war movement in this country, that there is a feeling that Lyndon Johnson can never be forgiven for what his administration did to American GIs and to the people of Vietnam. Personally, I feel the crimes that were committed against the people of Vietnam are on the order of seriousness of the war crimes committed by Germany, Nazi Germany in World War II. And that the use of incendiary weapons and anti-personnel weapons and toxic chemicals and the bombing of dikes and civilian areas north and south is a blot on this country's record that perhaps can never be erased.
It is difficult to assess the whole without understanding the parts. To achieve a more balanced understanding of Mr. Johnson, Second Sunday talked with a number of distinguished authorities in such fields as agriculture, urban affairs, civil liberties, conservation. Ted Smart, NBC News Chicago, discussed a farm view of the president with Charles Schuman, president of the huge, conservative American Farm Bureau Federation.
What has been your impression of the Johnson administration? It's been an administration with almost unlimited capacity to spend money. They have doled out the money both in agriculture and foreign aid and poverty and everything else all around the world as well as in this country. The result is we have very dangerous and rapid inflation going on at the present time. This is particularly damaging to farm people whose costs of production have been going up while prices have been holding the same or going down. Another impression of the Johnson administration has been that they assumed that they could manage the economy. That assumption has not proven to be true. And agriculture is a good example where, as a result of this attempt to regulate and control, farmers are in worse shape now than they were several years ago.
In Cleveland, Joe Mossbrook, NBC News, talked with that city's mayor, Carl Stokes, about the president's leadership in the field of urban affairs.
Which specific programs do you think will have the greatest long-lasting effect in solving the problems of the city?
The problems of the city are so intermeshed and have so many facets to them that I wouldn't single out one, or just probably for sake of discussion, I'll mention some, like the federal aid to education, which was once taboo, and this man took it and made it a fact, and now people realize and understand that they have to have that great federal aid if, in fact, they're going to provide full quality education for all of their children. The Housing Act that he passed this last year is going to be historical. I don't care what else is done in subsequent years, but never before has such a bill been passed. And then when you look at in the civil rights area, no president ever has done as much by way of passage of legislation or by way of actually making high-level policy positions open to the Negro American.
Mr. Johnson has been under almost constant attack from the new left, and it would seem then to follow that his leadership in the field of civil liberties was one reason for the hostility. Jim Iyer, NBC News, New York, asked John Pemberton, executive director of the prestigious American Civil Liberties Union,
what kind of a record did the Johnson administration have as far as civil liberties, not civil rights, but civil liberties are concerned?
In some respects, the Johnson years were very outstanding for accomplishments in the field of civil liberties, not only in terms of the accomplishments of the judiciary, and particularly the notable decisions of the Supreme Court that did go far, much farther perhaps than the court had gone in any comparable prior period toward protection of individual liberties insofar as the court can do so with its decisions. But many of the administration's commitments were notable for their civil liberties flavor. I have in mind the positions of the administration in response to its own President's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice. The recommendations of that commission were embodied in the administration's recommendations for crime control legislation. And in many respects, they would have gone quite far toward advancing crime control at the same time that they were protecting civil liberties. For example, the administration went farther than any prior administration in seeking to regulate the use of wiretapping to protect the privacy of citizens. The Congress didn't do so well with it, though.
Dr. Kenneth Clark, a Negro member of the New York State Board of Regents and a distinguished civil rights leader, talked about President Johnson and civil rights with Dean Mell.
Dr. Clark, can you list any solid accomplishments of the Johnson administration in the area of civil rights?
Yes, I think there are many solid accomplishments of the Johnson administration in the area of civil rights. I think some of the most significant and certainly among the strongest civil rights bills that have been passed since the Reconstruction were passed in the Johnson administration. The Civil Rights Bill of 1964, Civil Rights Bill of 1965, the Voting Rights Act, the most recent Civil Rights Bill in the area of open housing. And I suppose the most specific thing in terms of the Johnson administration contribution toward the goal of racial equality in America has been the activity of the Johnson administration in terms of voting rights, the registration of Negroes in the South, the fact that the federal government has taken the initiative in seeing that Negroes' right to register and vote be protected. And the fact that as a result of this, one has gone in the last 3 years or so from 70 Negro elected officials in the South to over 300. These are not insignificant, and there is a tendency to be cynical or poo-poo these types of developments, but I think they are fundamental.
Never before have so many become so concerned with our environment, with the problems of air and water pollution, and the preservation of diminishing resources. In San Francisco, Gene DiCardo asked David Bowers, Executive Secretary of the noted outdoor Sierra Club, about his impressions of the Johnson years in those critical areas.
He has made one of the major contributions to conservation, considering all the presidents who've been working on conservation.
Let's break it down into some of the specifics. For example, in the area of new parks, so important in a growing country.
The two new parks that we're delighted with are the Redwood National Park in Northern California and the North Cascade National Park in the state of Washington. We know that an unprecedented thing has been done. Never before has so much money been spent for a national park. And we are glad for the leadership of this administration and some of our very good friends in Congress who made this thing possible.
Does this also encompass areas of scenic improvement?
Yes, it does. Scenic improvement, but also the protection of areas that were already that needed no improvement. The National Wilderness System has been enlarged. Areas have been added to that in various parts of the country, from New Jersey to California. There was a new National Wild River System set up, and a new national trail system. And altogether, these are major moves, and there's been a new attention to setting up quality standards for water and for air, and we're not going to make it, any of us, if we don't keep our air and water usable.
In the noisy, active airport at Atlanta, Steve Barkin of station WSB talked with informal historians, people, sales clerks and engineers, students and janitors. Without hedging an adjective or mincing a verb, they expressed their opinions of the president with the Texas hat.
I'm glad to see him leaving because I believe any change should have to be an improvement.
He don't run the country like he should because he lets too much stuff get by from other countries, like instance such as the Pueblo and just all kind of stuff like that. He just lets it get by and he don't seem to do anything about it.
I feel that his home policy has been exceptionally good, and from a world standpoint, I feel it has been negative, the policy in regard to Vietnam in particular.
Oh, I never thought he was too good. I mean, I don't know. It seems like to me he stayed more at his ranch than he did in the White House, the president. And I just never cared too terribly much about him.
Well, I think he was a magnificent man. He was a good president while he was in there, and I voted for him, and I wish we could have kept him in there, and everybody seemed to like him. He did lots for the colored peoples, and we all thought he was a nice president.
I think he did a pretty good job. I think he kept the economy going real good, and although the war in Vietnam is sort of drained, I think he's done a pretty good job with that.
It is a truism among diplomats that a whisper in Washington is thunder over China, indicating, of course, that when the world's most powerful free nation sneezes, other countries run for their overcoats. How then has the world considered the Johnson years? In Jerusalem, Alvin Rosenfeld of NBC News talked to Israel's eloquent foreign minister, Abba Eban.
How would you evaluate the impact of the Johnson years of administration as President of the United States on the Middle East and its problems?
The general trend of the Johnson administration's policy in the Middle East has been constructive. I've noticed especially that American-Israeli relations were consolidated and reinforced during that period. The Johnson administration, of course, did not begin or inaugurate the tradition of American-Israel friendship. It inherited that tradition from previous administrations, going right back to the establishment of Israel in 1948, but it did add certain dimensions of its own. It strongly upheld the doctrine of Israel's independence and Israel's sovereignty. It refused to have any truck with the Arab policy of refusing to accept Israel in the family of nations. It emphasized Israel's deep roots in the history and reality and destiny of the Middle East, and it took important measures to ensure that Israel would be able to look after her own defense.
All Soviet spokesmen speak with the same voice. Kenneth Bernstein of NBC News Moscow interviewed Vikenty Matveev, diplomatic correspondent for the Soviet government newspaper Izvestia.
From a Soviet point of view, how would you assess the presidency of Lyndon Johnson?
I think there were good opportunities for both countries to develop their relations when President Johnson took over. But these opportunities, in the main, were not materialized owing to the war in Vietnam. So I think the main positive achievement, though it doesn't refer exactly to the sphere of Soviet-American relations, is the Non-Proliferation Nuclear Treaty, which has been negotiated successfully with the active participation of the United States and the Soviet Union.
One of the highlights of the Johnson administration was the summit meeting between President Johnson and Prime Minister Kosygin at Glassboro. Do you think this, in retrospect, had any historic importance in maintaining world peace or in the relations between the two countries, or was it just a passing event?
I think it was a good meeting, and it did some good at a time when the international scene was far from being good. So this sort of meetings should be arranged, and I think regularly.
In England, NBC newsman David Webber sought an opinion from Michael Foot, a vocal member of the majority Labour Party, but also one of its militant minority spokesmen.
For the first few months, it did look as if, that is, the first few months after the election of the Labour government here in 1964, it did look as if there would be a closer collaboration between Britain and the United States than there had been for years. But all that became overcast by the Vietnam War not because the government here was immediately broke off relations or anything of that sort. Indeed, the British government, much against the desires of the bulk of people in the labor movement, was very sympathetic towards the Johnson government over Vietnam, and maybe still is. But I believe there has been a growing antagonism towards the Vietnamese war, both in this country as there has been in the United States. And I fear that one consequence of the United States action in Vietnam was to injure the position of the United Nations. I think that the United States should have responded at a much earlier date to the proposals of U Thant as Secretary General of the United Nations. I think also that the actions of the United States in Santo Domingo injured the position of the United Nations.
Certainly there can be no valid assessment of Johnsonian foreign policy without considering his relationship to the United Nations. NBC correspondent Pauline Frederick talked to former UN ambassador under President Johnson, George Ball.
What do you feel President Johnson's real attitude was about the UN?
I think he recognized it on two levels, as an embodiment of aspirations and as a practical instrument of policy. And on the second level, the fact that during the last few years, the great concentration of American foreign policy has been on the Southeast Asia, and specifically on Vietnam, has meant that the UN hasn't played as large a role as it might otherwise have been the case, because it's been quite disabled from taking very effective action so far as Vietnam is concerned.
Well, it was obvious to many that part of the disability of the United Nations to take any effective action was that American policy was so unilateral that it didn't give the UN any real opportunity to do so.
Well, I wouldn't accept the question of American policy being unilateral. American policy, so far as Vietnam is concerned, has differed from the attitude of most of the nations of the world, which has been one of the reasons why the UN has not been an effective forum, because most of the world hasn't been very sympathetic with American policy.
It would be difficult to find two men who have known President Johnson more intimately than Bill Moyers, for almost 4 years his news secretary, and Walt Rostow, a special assistant and one of the key draftsmen of Vietnam policies. In New York, Jim Harriet of NBC News asked Moyers about Mr. Johnson.
For what will he be most remembered as having accomplished?
I think he will have been the bridge between the old political, social, and economic environment of the formidable New Deal days and the so-called new democracy politics and environment of the 1970s and 1980s. You cannot in America break your institutions sharply. There must be a kind of steady, gradual accommodation. And Lyndon Johnson, reaching for the future but coming so decidedly from a historic era in American life, the New Deal and post-New Deal age, was a bridge. Now, this is not a tangible, concrete accomplishment that one can point to readily and have other people understand it, but I think it's a real one.
In Washington, Mr. Rostow summarized the presidential philosophy of the complex controversy known as Vietnam, especially for this edition of Second Sunday.
This nation has long recognized the vital significance of who controls Southeast Asia. In 1941, there was President Roosevelt's sharp reaction to the Japanese takeover of Indochina. In 1954, there was our willingness to support the Geneva Accords if others did not violate them by force. In 1954 also, by the Senate's overwhelming acceptance of the Manila Treaty, which covered Laos and South Vietnam as well as Thailand and the Philippines. In 1962, by our insistence in the Geneva Accords on Laos that all foreign forces get out of Laos and not transit that nation in hostile action against another. When President Johnson decided in 1965 that we would have to put large forces into South Vietnam, he did so not merely in support of a treaty obligation, but because he believed, like his predecessors, that vital interests of the United States were at stake, and that if we did not act in the face of the introduction of regular North Vietnamese units into South Vietnam, the fate of all of Asia would be endangered. 3.5 years of hard fighting have brought us now to a point where our limited objectives in Southeast Asia appear attainable if the United States remains steady. That is, allows free of foreign forces, the return of the North Vietnamese forces from South Vietnam, and the right of the South Vietnamese, without coercion, to design their own future on the basis of self-determination and the principle of one man, one vote. And as a result of what the South Vietnamese and their allies have done, a new spirit of cooperation and hope is moving through an Asia which is also experiencing a remarkable surge of economic and social progress. If we continue to help Asians build that region, our children and grandchildren may be able to live with an Asia that is free and prosperous and secure, and an Asia in which our responsibilities will diminish as the Asians grow stronger and work more closely together. An Asia capable of living in security and a spirit of reconciliation with mainland China. These are the possibilities that have flowed from the very hard decision that President Johnson had to make in 1965, the sacrifices of our men in the field and their allies, and from the very great burden we have carried in our national life over these difficult years.
When Mr. Johnson approved Chicago as the site of the Democratic National Convention of 1968, he certainly had no suspicion so democratic a city would so divide the Democratic Party. On that city's sidewalks, Ted Smart of NBC News asked Chicagoans,
What do you think of Mr. Johnson? What kind of a job has he done?
Well, I think he may have done a better job than we're even aware of now, because I think the poor man has had a very bad press and general public relations, and his personality has come off less than attractive to much of the American public, and that may have obscured what he's actually accomplished.
I think he's done more than the average president in civil rights, at least made people aware of the two races in this country and the situation.
I feel that he's given an all-out effort to try to end the war in Vietnam. It's just that I think the press has been severely critical of him. The president himself is a man that saw action in World War II, and I think he realizes the problem. And I firmly believe there's a lot more to the story than the average individual is hearing about. And I think it's these things that can't be brought out that are slowing down the progress for peace.
I think Mr. Johnson will go down as being only fair in the sense of good, bad, or indifferent. I think that his approach has been one of expediency, in that he would meet a crisis with a near-term solution.
Well, let's put it this way. I think he had a lot of guts to stick out on what he said about the Vietnam, but I didn't think it was too smart of him to make it bigger, to go into it that much. But he had a lot of guts. That's all I can say for him.
When President Johnson becomes Mr. Johnson, he will return to his first professional career, teaching. At the University of Texas, Mr. Johnson will work with Dr. William Livingston, head of the university's committee for the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs. The professor told Charles Ward of station WFAA,
My guess is that if the Vietnam War had not become what it became, that Lyndon Johnson would be very widely acclaimed right now as one of the nation's most successful presidents. And the tragedy of the Johnson history and the Johnson administration is that despite its very large accomplishments on the domestic scene, the crisis of Vietnam has inevitably reduced a high reputation to something less than high. Whether it's going to result in history's ranking Johnson as an unsuccessful president, I doubt, simply because there have been so many successes on the domestic front. But it's very difficult to escape the daily headline, and the daily headline has to do not with peaceful accomplishments at home, but non-peaceful failures abroad.
The eminent former chairman of the history department at Columbia University, Professor Henry Graff, took a long-range view of Mr. Johnson in a conversation with Jim Harriet.
Lyndon Johnson had the bad luck to come along with great skills in the performance of an enterprise that no longer seemed to provide all the answers. And if you want to be reckoned a great president, you have to have a lot of luck. And John Kennedy said once that in reckoning whether a man is a great president or not, you have to know what that man had going for him. And if I may put it this way, I think Lyndon Johnson, quite apart from Vietnam, didn't have history going for him.
Mr. Johnson first came to national attention as a member of Congress. In the Senate, he served as one of the most effective, influential majority leaders in congressional history. His successor as majority leader, Mike Mansfield of Montana, contemplated the Johnson years in an interview with Paul Duke, NBC News.
In the field of domestic policy, what he has done in health, education, civil rights, and conservation will, I think, come pretty close to equaling all which had been done by all the presidents preceding him.
What do you think his greatest failure may have been?
Well, I think that the tragedy, of course, is Vietnam. And it is because of that that so many other difficulties, so much divisiveness, so much unrest has come about.
You think that he is going to be remembered perhaps as one of our foremost presidents then?
In the field of domestic policy, without question, history will have to take a pretty close recording 25, 50 years from now as to whether or not Vietnam was in our own vital interest.
On the opposite side of the aisle, Pennsylvania's Hugh Scott, a longtime Republican opponent and friend of Mr. Johnson, gave this assessment to Duke.
I think even more truly than his predecessor, his term in office was consisted of days of lightning and years of drums. In other words, of conflict, of warfare at home and abroad, of frustration, but at the same time seasoned and peppered with greater moments, achievements in space, the landing on the moon, and in the first 2 years or so of his term, some very substantial domestic achievements. I have always felt that President Johnson has been more harshly treated than he as a human being deserves. And I think that is partly due to the fact that intellectuals just don't like Texas accent and Texas ways of doing things.
In the November election, Allard Lowenstein of New York, a vigorous opponent of Mr. Johnson's Vietnam policies, won a congressional seat, campaigning against the president. Duke talked with him about LBJ.
But he was reelected on one platform with one set of commitments, and for reasons that I'm sure he felt were adequate, but which in, I think, historical terms will stand as not adequate and in fact as damaging, he abandoned the course that he had committed himself to, in my judgment, when we worked for him in '64. And from there on out, I think the story is a very sad one. I think that all you have to do to measure it is to realize where the country is now and where it was in 1963. And as I say, without impugning him as a man or his motives, simply in terms of his leadership and his policies, one has to come to the very sad conclusion that few administrations have more quickly done more damage to the basic fiber and the basic hopes and needs of the American people.
The canyon streets of Manhattan are windy, bleak, and chill in January. Lem Tucker, an NBC reporter, walked those streets and sought among New Yorkers an answer to the puzzle of Mr. Johnson's administration.
Ma'am, what's your opinion of the Johnson years?
I think they were utterly useless, and all they did was cause us more trouble than we were already in from the Kennedy years.
I thought that they were very difficult years. These were times that people, their ideas, their thoughts were changing, and all our ideas had to be worked more or less in conjunction with them. Mr. Johnson had very many problems, and I think he coped with them very well.
I really believe that he has been a good president, except people criticize him because of the war. But that's not his fault. He inherited that from the president before, from the other one before, from President Eisenhower practically, President Kennedy.
He managed to accomplish all the things that Kennedy thought he could accomplish but didn't. Kennedy really didn't accomplish very much. He didn't have a Congress working along with him. Johnson did. He got through many bills.
I think he's been a president. It's about all I can say. He's had his ups, he's had his downs.
I feel that at the beginning, they seemed to be achieving a lot of what they wanted to do as far as legislation was concerned. The last few years, I think, have been a disaster because of Vietnam. I think with Vietnam in the forefront of affairs, everything else is overshadowed.
Johnson has succeeded in doing probably what no other president in this country has ever done, is to create a total lack of confidence in the White House and the executive branch of the government, so that I don't think we have any moral leadership. I don't think we have any political leadership such as it has inspired us, even from such a colorless man as Dwight Eisenhower.
Of all the correspondents who have, over the past 5 years, covered the White House, few have had a closer contact with Mr. Johnson than Ray Scherer, NBC News White House correspondent. Here is his commentary on one of the most curious aspects of the paradox that is the personality of Mr. Johnson.
No man in public life likes to think of himself as unpopular, as not beloved and trusted by his fellow countrymen. But the need to be liked runs a little stronger in Lyndon Johnson than it does in most public men. The president drew huge crowds when he ran against Barry Goldwater in 1964, and one could get the impression he was a president of vast popularity. The president used to call reporters to the platform when he was through speaking and point to the immensity of the throngs. One night, after a particularly exciting day on the stump in the fall of 1964, the president told a group of reporters riding his plane, "Now, I don't want to sound vain, but I think I am the most popular president since Franklin Roosevelt." 1964 was a landslide, and Mr. Johnson probably had good reason to feel he had established a right to national leadership, if not affection. In that campaign, he had spoken against sending American boys to fight a war in Asia. Later events forced or at least served to drive the president deeper into Vietnam. Many people came to feel that he was ready to double talk about such things in order to win votes. The president felt that the enormous success of his legislative program after the election had earned him the admiration of the nation. But his success here was ironic. Many citizens were prone to think the president accomplished these victories in Congress by a kind of political black art and only for political advantage. Perhaps the central reason for a president who had accomplished so much being something less than universally admired was that as the years wore on, Mr. Johnson grew out of communication with the people. Whereas at the beginning he had gone on television for every White House announcement, however minor, toward the end he shrank from television, the best means of communication with the people. The president once forlornly told a group of network executives, "Every time I go on TV, I lose money." Finally, on March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson went back on national television to bare his soul, to tell the nation, almost in so many words, that because he had become a force for division rather than unity, he was stepping out of national politics. And those who did not love him said nothing so became Lyndon Johnson as his renouncing further office. Ray Scherer, NBC News, Washington.
In a sense, it can be said that Mr. Nixon won the presidency, not by defeating Hubert Humphrey, but by his vigorous campaign against Mr. Johnson. At a recent dinner, Mr. Nixon offered a toast to, and this assessment of, the President of the United States.
He has been a man who has worked as hard in that office as any man who has ever held it. He has been a man who is as deeply concerned for bringing peace to this nation and the world as anyone in this room. He's been a man who's been deeply disappointed because he has not been able to achieve that. And whether we agree or disagree, and I happen to disagree with some of his policies, we do not question certainly the fact that he has dedicated his life to public service and that in the presidency has given everything that he possibly could to that arduous and tremendous task. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to rise with me to the President of the United States.
So that is how his contemporaries evaluate that enigma of a Texan, a president who loves a 10-gallon hat, the poor, speeding across the Texas ranch in a white Lincoln, education, and one who sacrificed himself politically on the altar of his beliefs in Vietnam. Somewhere behind the shadows, beyond the anger, the resentment, the mockery, and the hate that obscures Mr. Johnson, is a president who may have had a far more constructive impact upon this nation than his few idolaters or numerous detractors would consider at this moment either possible or believable. This is Bill Ryan.
You've been listening to Second Sunday. Tonight, The Johnson Years. The Johnson Years was written and produced by Herbert Gordon, directed by Don Washington, research assistant Susan Peretz, tape engineer Mort Nelson. The Johnson Years was produced under the direction and control of NBC News. This is Jerry Damon.